Hello. This is really part 2 of how to use commas when you punctuate. First lesson we saw, I suppose you would say, the main ways we use commas. Use them commas in a series, commas separating clauses in many cases, commas with all kinds of different introductory material. Well, the commas have a lot of other uses as well. And if you think about it, they really do help us to visualize things, help us to understand the logic of a particular sentence. They really are helpful aids for us as we read. And so as you write as well, it really helps you to communicate effectively if you understand different ways that commas are used. We use commas to separate conjunctive adverbs. In addition to items covered in the first one, conjunctive adverbs are also set off by commas. And conjunctive adverbs are adverbs which join sentence parts. Most common conjunctive adverbs are these: also, besides, furthermore, however, indeed, instead, moreover, nevertheless, otherwise, therefore, thus. Now, a lot of these can be used in other ways as well, but a lot of times we do see them used as a conjunction. So, John headed this way, however, he did not see me. Okay, it is an adverb, but it's used here as a conjunction. And the way we would punctuate this sentence is we would have a semicolon separating the two clauses, and then the conjunctive adverb itself would be set off by commas. And that's true regardless of where in the clause it appears. If you said the sentence, John headed this way, he did not see me, however, would still be set off by a comma, even though it was not at the beginning of the clause. Now, you do have to be careful, because some of these conjunctive adverbs sometimes are used simply as plain old ordinary adverbs. In this sentence, John saw Kate, also he saw Jean. Here it is acting conjunctively. It's kind of joining the two clauses together. But in this sentence, John saw Kate, he also saw Jean. There it's just acting as a simple adverb, so you wouldn't be setting it off by commas. So you do have to be a little bit careful about that. Okay. Also, sometimes it depends on what you mean. If we're using the word however as just an emphatic form of how, it's not set off by commas. So we say, however, did he do that? That's different from saying, however, did he do that? You could perhaps in some cases have that however set off by comma, but it means something else. So, commas are also used to set off contrasting expressions that begin with not. This, not that, something like that. I wanted this one, comma, not that one. Notice in the second sentence, we went to New Hampshire, comma, not New Jersey, comma, for our vacation. There is also a comma at the end of the expression, if it's not at the end of the sentence, again, to set off that expression. Got that? Okay, an important use of commas sometimes are commas with restrictive and non-restrictive modifiers. A modifying word, phrase, or clause following a noun, including in a positive, is set off by commas if it presents information which is not essential to identify the noun or the meaning of the sentence. This is called a non-restrictive modifier. However, if it's essential for the meaning of the sentence, you don't use a comma. So, for example, in this sentence, any student not sitting down will get a detention. Okay, that modifier, not sitting down, is essential to the meaning of the sentence. If I remove that, I've completely changed the meaning. Now I'm saying any student will get a detention. Okay, so this is an example of a restrictive modifier. In other words, it restricts the meaning of the sentence. If you remove it, the meaning really significantly changes. So there's no comma there. That's essential for the meaning of the sentence, so we don't set it off by a comma. However, in this sentence, Marcia Gomes, who was not sitting down, just got a detention. Okay, in this case, that expression is set off by commas because Marcia Gomes is a name, it's a specific person, so we know who it is talking about even without that clause. So, we drop the clause and we still know who we're talking about. Maria Gomes just got a detention. It does add additional information which is helpful for us to understand why she got a detention, but it's not essential to the overall meaning of the sentence. So if it's a non-restrictive, if it doesn't restrict the meaning of the sentence, then it's set off by commas. If it follows, the modifier following the word it modifies. Okay? Now, sometimes the punctuation may depend on the situation. For example, if I have just one sister, or the reader already knows who I'm talking about, if I said my sister Martha is a nurse, Martha would be set off by commas. However, if I have more than one sister, and it's not otherwise clear whom I am talking about, her name is essential to identify the sister. So, say my sister Martha is a nurse. Okay, in that case, there is no comma setting apart that appositive Martha because it's essential for understanding which sister I'm talking about. So, to make it clear, in this case, my sister Martha is a nurse, my sister Marianne is a teacher. Okay, in that case, it's clear I have two sisters. Okay, I do want to point out that notice that this depends on the situation. Okay, and the reader or the writer, has to understand the situation. Sometimes, I will get emails from people asking, why can't you just make a computer program that automatically corrects all the grammar mistakes? Well, this is a good example of why you can't do that, because you can't make a program that can know where the comma goes in a situation like this unless you've got a program that can read your mind. Okay, and so until they come up with software that reads your mind, you have to know the rules. Now, I just read something recently that Facebook is experimenting with software that somehow connects to your brain and supposedly reads brain waves or something like that. That sounds a little freaky to me, but anyway. For the time being, you got to know the rule. Okay, when a geographical name or location has two or more parts to it, you use a comma after each different type or part. And another comma follows the last item also, unless it's at the end of the sentence. So, if you say, I meant Pittsburgh, Kansas instead of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you need commas. And you need commas after the last item, too. So even this one, yeah, there's a comma between Pittsburgh and Kansas, but there needs to be a comma after Kansas as well. So, the correct way, I meant Pittsburgh, comma, Kansas, comma, instead of Pittsburgh, comma, Pennsylvania. if the parts are joined by a preposition, then you don't need a comma, because the preposition does the job of the comma. I meant Pittsburgh in Kansas instead of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Now, if you said Pittsburgh in Kansas, not Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, you would use a comma because it has that not rule, but that's, of course, a different rule. Okay. Similarly, when a date is made up of two or more parts, you use a comma to separate the parts when both parts are words or both parts are numbers. You don't need a comma if one part is a number and one part's a word. So, we will meet Friday, July 15th. You need a comma between the Friday and July. Those two parts both are words, so you use a comma to separate them. October 31st, 1517. Again, you would use a comma between the two numbers, between the 31st and the 1517. But in this case, because it's not at the end of the sentence, you also need a comma at the end of the expression. So the correct way would be October 31st, comma, 1517, comma, is one of the most significant dates in history. In fact, as I'm making this video, we're celebrating the 500th anniversary. Can you imagine? Okay. Similarly, you don't need a comma, say, to separate the items if one's word and one's number. So October 1517, there are no commas. And similarly, if you use prepositions, you don't need the commas. On a Sunday in December 1941, okay, you don't need a comma after that Sunday. Now, you do need a comma after 1941, but that's because, you know, it's a group of introductory prepositional phrases that, you know, has nothing to do with the date, it just has to do with the business of prepositional phrases. Okay. If you have titles that follow names, okay, those titles are set off by commas, and there's a comma between the name and the title, and then if it's not at the end of the sentence, there's a second comma. So, Kenneth Griffey Jr., okay, could have broken Maris's record, okay. There's a comma between Griffey and Jr., and then a comma after Jr. If you have multiple titles, there's a comma between each title. Again, we don't see that a whole lot, but sometimes you see that for academic reasons. So here we have the book was written by John Kenneth Galbraith, comma, AB, comma, MA, comma, PhD, comma, DSc, comma, LitD. Okay, notice there isn't a comma at the end because it comes at the end of the sentence. But each title is set off by commas, so you know which is the separate title. Okay, numerical titles following a name are not set off by commas, again, because part of it is word, part of it is number. So, Aloysius Otto Culp III, you don't have to set off the third by commas. When you think about that, you see a lot of titles like that with kings, you know, Henry IV or something like that, and you understand, you know, they're not set off by commas. So if it's a number, you don't set it off by commas, but if it's a title that's words like junior or like different academic degrees, things like that, then they are set off by commas. Okay, use a comma to separate each part of an address that has two or more parts. Basically follows the same pattern as geographical names, and again, commas are not needed if you're using prepositions to join the parts. So, write me in care of Post Office Box 203, comma, Shelton, comma, Connecticut. And the comma after the state or province and before the postal code is usually omitted because, you know, one's a word, one's a number. So, now, if you're writing an address, like on, say, on a return address for a letter or on an envelope or something, then you don't need the commas when you change the line. So you would just have P.O. Box 203 without the comma if Shelton, Connecticut is on a separate line. In that case, you still would have a comma between Shelton and Connecticut. Now, if you are using the 2-digit capital letter postal abbreviation for an address, then you don't need a comma even between the city and the state, or the city and the province. So, if P.O. Box 203, Shelton, CT for Connecticut, doesn't have any commas at all because it's 2 separate lines. This one, you would have a comma between the local address and the city because it's all in one line. So 475 Gray J Way, comma, Hamilton, ON, Hamilton, Ontario. You wouldn't need a comma between the Hamilton and Ontario with the 2 capital letter postal code. Okay, we use commas after the salutation, sometimes called the greeting, in a personal letter, and after the complimentary close in all letters. So, dear Fred, comma, my dearest Emmeline, comma, for the greeting, and for the closing as well, sincerely, comma, truly yours, comma, before you have the signature. In numbers more than 3 digits, you use a comma after every 3rd digit going from right to left. If you think about it, the area of North America is approximately 9,435,000 square miles. Okay, that's a little hard to read. I mean, you can look at it, you can figure it out, but it's easier to read if you have the commas in there. So then we see, 9,435,000 is much easier to read. Now, some numbers don't take zip code, don't take commas, such as zip codes, phone numbers, page numbers, serial numbers, house numbers, and dates of years. So, for example, I'm doing this in 2017. We don't use a comma for 2017. Now, just for your information, many European countries use a comma in place of the decimal point and use periods or blank spaces to separate every 3rd digit. So kind of do the opposite of the way it's done in the English-speaking countries. So in the United States, we would say 2,367.48 euros. We would have a comma after the 2,000 and a decimal point to separate the euros from the cents. In France, they would probably do it the opposite way. They would have the period to separate the thousands and a comma where we would use a decimal point. In some cases, you would see they would just use a space instead of the period and the comma instead of the decimal point. So sometimes if you see numbers written that way, it's just from a different country where the method is just a little bit different. Okay, words intentionally left out of clauses may be shown by a comma. That's particularly if there's some kind of parallel construction and the missing words are clearly understood. So, George liked the color green, John red. Okay, in that case, you would have a comma after John. We understand we're saying John liked the color red. But we understand there would be missing words there. Okay. Not real common, but it is used on occasion. Commas are used to set off the he said, she said clause, and the commas always go before the quotation. So these two are both incorrect. Here there is no comma when there needs to be a comma because we've got Henrietta asked, you've got the he said, she said clause. And the second one, this is incorrect because the comma goes before the quotation marks. Okay, so this would be the correct way of doing it. Henrietta asked, comma, open quotation marks, do you want to go with me? This is also incorrect because the comma comes after the closing quotation mark. So you want the comma to come before the closing quotation mark. I will go with you, Jane replied. And notice in this case, where the he said, she said clause is in the middle of the sentence being quoted. Anyway, comma, close quotation mark, she said, comma, open quotation marks, I have to go. Okay. So that is the pattern then. He said, she said clause set off by commas, and the comma always goes before the quotation marks, whether it's an opening or closing quotation marks. Sometimes it's necessary to add a comma just to make a sentence clearer. In the kitchen, cupboards were empty. It would help the reader if you have a comma after kitchen. Usually for a three-word introductory prepositional phrase, we don't worry about the comma. But here, it might be a little confusing because you might think you're talking about kitchen cupboards. And so, in the kitchen cupboard, something or other. So we put a comma just to make that a little bit clearer. And sometimes there are other reasons. We just use a comma just to make something clear. The room was full of crying babies and mothers. If you don't have the comma, it might sound like the mothers were crying too. And unless that's what you mean, you would say, the room was full of crying babies, comma, and mothers. Or probably a better way of doing that would be to say the room was full of mothers and crying babies. That way you don't need the comma, and we understand it's just the babies that are crying. Sometimes, for emphasis, adjectives or paired adjectives follow the noun they modify. If you do it that way, then that adjective or adjective pair is set off by commas. The car, bright red, stood out in the parking lot. Okay? We usually would say the bright red car, you wouldn't need commas, but sometimes we say the car, bright red, for emphasis. In that case, it would be set off by commas. And again, if you have a pair of adjectives, especially if they're coordinate adjectives, then you have to use the word and to separate them if they follow the word they modify. So the dessert, sweet and rich, was delightful. Okay, has to use the word and it's set off by commas. You do not use a comma to separate the paired parts in paired compound subjects or compound verbs. Sometimes people throw in commas because it looks like it's a compound sentence, but it's really not. It's just a compound subject or a compound verb. So she lets me watch her mom and pop fight. Okay, there is no comma there because mom and pop is the compound subject, and it has the word and already there. And the same if it was a compound verb. They would argue over money and scream about his late nights. And again, single subject, compound verb. It's not a compound sentence, so you don't need the comma. By the way, I use this sentence. There's an old song from the 50s. It's called "She Lets Me Watch Her Mom and Pop Fight." That's where that came from. It's really a very silly song, but I just mentioned that in case you were wondering where that sentence came from. Commas do not set off subordinate clauses unless some other specific comma rule applies. Namely, they're clauses in a series, or the clauses are functioning as appositives, or restrictive modifiers, or they're introductory adverb clauses. So, he told me that I'd better come so that they would avoid serious trouble. You don't need any commas there. That I had better come is a noun clause, but it's a direct object. You don't separate the clause there. And so that they would avoid serious trouble is an adverb clause, but it's an adverb clause that comes at the end of the sentence. So, you don't need any commas. And you don't separate the adjectives from the noun they modify if they come before the noun. So the bright red car was a Corvette. There's no comma separating them. Anyway, those are some of the other comma rules, including a few cases when you don't use commas. But you see, a comma is very useful, and if you think about it, it does make a sentence a lot easier to understand if you have commas in the appropriate places. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in class. If you're watching this and you're not in my English class, you can always go to englishplus.com and go to the contact page, and somebody will answer a question if you have any questions on this lesson. Thank you very much.